team here, and our first objective is to have a general understanding of the components that make up the cardiovascular system. So we're not just looking at the heart, but what is the entire system, the blood cells, the vessels, what are all the components involved? So the components would be the heart itself, and the heart is a muscular pump. The blood vessels, which are really the conduits that allow blood to be moved throughout the entire circulatory system. And then the blood, which is kind of the vehicle, what is in the blood vessels that is helping to circulate oxygen, nutrients, etc. And the blood is going to mainly be comprised of hemoglobin. You know, hemoglobin is the transport of oxygen, and so that's an important component of the blood. So the function of the cardiovascular system is transportation of substances, oxygen and nutrients going towards cells. These are going from large vessels out to the capillary network where diffusion can take place. And that diffusion is bidirectional. So we're offloading nutrients and oxygen, but we're picking up waste material, byproducts from metabolic processes, from organs like the liver and the kidneys, which are huge waste product organs. We also want to think about general distribution, transportation of immune cells to help fight pathogens, clotting proteins to help clot the blood, especially at the site of injuries, and then just the supply that's needed, hormone signaling, etc., for various target cells. So it's extremely important system to the functioning of all the other body systems, right? Now we can look at an overview of the heart itself, the major vessels, and the valves. This is going to be important in understanding how the heart functions. And the GIF in the corner here just shows how the 4 phases of the cardiac cycle allow for the valves to close and open so that blood is only moving in one direction, right? We don't want blood going back into the preceding chambers. It should be going into the atria, down into the ventricles, and then out through one of the main vessels, one of the main arteries. So that unidirectional nature of blood moving through the heart is ensured by the presence of the 4 valves. So just to go over the sequence of the valves and the chambers. So we have 2 receiving chambers, which are the atria, excuse me. They are on top. Here's the right atrium. Here's the left atrium. And then they regulate flow down to the ventricles. So the atria are receiving chambers. The ventricles are pumping or ejection chambers. So that blood moves from the atria down into the ventricle, the right and left ventricle respectively. So here's right ventricle. And then in between right atria and right ventricle, we have the tricuspid valve. And tricuspid valve is one of our AV valves. AV meaning that it's between an atria and a ventricle. So the right AV valve is uniquely named the tricuspid valve. On the left, we have a similar left AV valve, but this is uniquely named the bicuspid valve because there are only 2 cusps on the leaflet of this valve. So from there, blood moves down into the ventricle, and then from the ventricle, it's going to get ejected out into the artery, either the pulmonary artery on the right side. This is going towards the pulmonary circulation into the lungs to be to drop off that deoxygenated blood into the lungs and pick up new oxygenated or oxygen from the lungs. Or on the left side of the heart, blood can move from the left ventricle out into the aorta, where it can move around to the rest of the systemic circulation. So the right ventricle communicates to the pulmonary circulation or the lungs only, and the left ventricle communicates to the rest of the body where diffusion of that oxygen can take place. Okay, so really important to think about how the valves are positioned to allow that unidirectional flow. Okay, here's another schematic that shows the 2 branches of the circulation. So the systemic circulation, blood that leaves the left ventricle, it goes through the aortic valve because it goes to the aorta, and then it goes out into the arteries, arterioles, and then the capillary beds. At the capillary bed, this is where oxygen is dropped off and waste is picked up, right? From there, it goes into venules and then veins, which are slightly larger. Then it goes back to the right atrium. So deoxygenated blood comes back to the right atrium only, and then it goes to the right ventricle, and then out through the pulmonary valve or the pulmonic valve. Then it goes out into the lungs, and here that deoxygenated blood can now receive oxygen. Remember, oxygenation takes place across the capillary beds at the lungs. We breathe it in, it goes down to the alveoli, then it's exchanged across the lungs. So here we can pick up new oxygen or fresh oxygen, and then that freshly oxygenated blood goes back to the left atrium, back to the left ventricle, and then it's going to be redistributed to the systemic circulation again. So notice that this is one big giant cycle, and every step happens in series. So we can think about both of these circulations as being a series fashion of circulation. So all of the blood has to go from the left ventricle, all of it must go out into the arteries and arterioles, all of it must go to the capillary beds, and then all of it must come back to the right side of the heart. Okay, so each step, there's no option. All of the blood has to go from the heart, has to go out into the circulation, has to come back, and then has to go to the lungs and back as well. So this is considered one giant series circulation. Now let's think about the branches of the blood vessels that we pass through. So from the heart, we go to large branching arteries. These are the largest branch of the vasculature, and these are going to take blood from the heart out to some of the smaller branches. So the arteries here have large elastic walls, which is allowing them to stretch and accommodate that large volume that's leaving the left side of the heart under tremendous ejaculatory or ejection force, right? When you think about the second branch of the system, the arterioles, arterioles are going to be where we have the highest resistance. So these are the smallest branches of the artery system, and this is where we have the most resistance. So arterioles are responsible for maintaining most of our blood pressure, the resistance that is our blood pressure. Then we have capillaries. Capillaries, we know, are the smallest branches, but they're the most abundant. They have the highest cross-sectional number in terms of how many individual capillaries exist in the body. So this is going to be where we have exchange of nutrients, exchange of oxygen, and waste as well. Then we get back to the return branch of the circulation. This is where we have venules. Venules are the smallest converging vessels. These are very similar in nature to capillaries, as we'll see, but their direction is back towards the heart, and they're usually carrying slightly deoxygenated blood. And then we get to larger venous structures, which are veins, and veins come right back into the atria. So when we think about the true definition of an artery is going to be taking blood away from the heart. A vein is going to be bringing blood back to the heart. So we don't want to think about an artery as always having oxygenated blood, because as we'll see, the pulmonary artery is an example where it's an artery, but it has mainly deoxygenated blood. And so when we think about its true definition of being an artery, it's because of its direction moving away from the heart and not necessarily the type of blood that's found within that vessel. Okay, let's think about the actual blood, the composition of the blood that is circulating in the vessels. So we've got erythrocytes, which are the main composition of blood. So if you were to take blood and spin it very quickly in a centrifuge machine, you would actually separate it by its volume, separated by its liquid component and its cellular components. So you would see that about 45% of that total blood volume is just erythrocytes, just red blood cells. And that sort of makes sense. The whole purpose of blood is for the circulation of oxygen. These erythrocytes have on them hemoglobin, which is what allows them to transport that oxygen. So most of that, about 45% of that is going to be red blood cells. Then we have a very small amount of white blood cells, which are leukocytes. These are our immune cells to help defend the body against pathogens, bacteria, etc. And then we also have platelets, which are cellular fragments. So platelets come from other cells that got really large and then pretty much exploded and created these cellular fragments, which is why they're perfect for helping the blood to clot, right? These help to be clotting factors that are extremely important in maintaining the anti-clotting of blood, especially in injury sites. So those two components together create what's called a buffy coat. And the buffy coat is the layer that sits on top of the erythrocytes, and this is about 1% of that total blood volume. Now, the rest of that is just going to be plasma, which is the watery component to blood. And we know that plasma is about 14% or so of our total blood volume, right? It's part of our extracellular fluid compartment, but it's going to be the most of what we find in blood, which is the volume or watery portion of blood. Okay, let's continue to discuss the series versus the parallel circuits. So we'll speak about two circuits in the cardiovascular system. The pulmonary circuit, which is supplied by the right side of the heart. So this is where blood, oxygen poor blood, leaves the right heart, leaves the right ventricle, goes out to the lungs, and this is how it can pick up oxygen and be resupplied, reoxygenated by the capillary beds that are found in the lungs. So blood vessels that are going from the heart to the lungs, as well as vessels that are coming from the lungs back to the left side of the heart, that is what comprises the pulmonary circuit. Okay, so right ventricle to lungs, lungs back to right atrium, that is the pulmonary part of the circuit. On the other end, the systemic circuit is supplied by the left side of the heart. So the left ventricle, which pumps blood into the aorta goes out to the general systemic circulation, and then it comes back into the inferior and superior vena cava, which come back into the right atrium. So that entire circuit, left heart, systemic circulation, right atrium, that is what comprises the systemic circuit. Okay, so as we described earlier, blood is flowing through the entire cardiovascular system in series. All of the blood has to go to the pulmonary circuit, all of it has to come back to the heart, all of it has to go out to the systemic circulation, and then all of it must come back to the heart before going back to the pulmonary again. So in that way, the overall cardiovascular system is a series flow. Alternatively, when blood is in the systemic circulation, sort of individually, now it's acting in a parallel flow. So when blood leaves your left ventricle, all of it doesn't go to your brain, and all of it doesn't go to your lungs, and all of it doesn't go to your liver. It's going to take options. When it leaves your left ventricle, some of it will go to your kidneys, some of it will go to your skin, some of it will go to your limbs. And here it can be said to be flowing in parallel circuit or in parallel flow. Similarly, when it's in the pulmonary circulation, so all of your blood leaving the right ventricle doesn't go to your left lung, and then all of it goes to your right. Some of it goes to your left lung, and then some of it goes to your right lung. So even within the individual pulmonary circuit, we can consider blood to be moving in a parallel flow. Okay. So really important to reiterate this series versus parallel. So if we think about the entire circulation, lungs to heart to body to heart back to lungs, this is considered a series in that all of the blood must stop at each of these points. However, if you look at the circulations more closely, if you look at the parallel circulation, blood within the systemic circulation is considered to be moving parallel because some of it goes to your liver, some to your kidneys, some to your bladder. So when blood leaves the left ventricle, it takes an optional route to supply all of your organs equally. And so this can be said to be parallel. Similarly, in your pulmonary circulation, some of it goes to your right, some of it goes to your left lung, and that can be considered an optional or parallel flow. All right. Okay. I'm going to take a brief pause here and see what questions we have on that so far. There aren't any questions. Okay. So again, looking at the series flow, this is the cardiovascular system as a whole, and we can consider this a closed system as well, simply because the blood never, unless you have an injury, obviously, or some type of bleeding or trauma, the blood never leaves these conduit. It goes to the heart, to the blood vessels, to the lungs, to the body, back to the heart, right? So when we think about how it moves through the entire cardiovascular system, all of the blood is moving in this entire series fashion, and there's no exit point, right? There's no point where blood is leaving the system. It's a closed loop or a closed system. When we think about how it flows to the individual circuits, however, now it's flowing in terms of going to the pulmonary circulation. It has to go to the lungs. Although it's going to both lungs individually, it has to all come back to the heart. So it's all going to be returned to its initial starting point. So we can think about even within its individual circuits, it's still a closed system. All right. Now, again, parallel flow, it has to go to arteries, arterioles, capillaries, and then it's going to go to individual capillary beds by option here. So when it leaves the left heart, some goes to your brain, some goes to your coronary circulation, which is the blood vessels that supply your heart muscle. Some go to your GI, your liver, your kidneys, etc. And so this is where we have the parallel flow as opposed to the overall series circulation.